I think Rachel's given you a big clue if you didn't already know. We're in 1 Kings 18 this morning. We're going to be reading from verse 16 when we get there and reading through to the end of that chapter. So it's a lengthy passage, but we need to read it all to see what happens and how the events unfold and all that it might speak to us this morning. But for context, we're in the second week of our new series called The God of Elijah and Elisha. And we're looking into several moments of the lives of these two prophets as a means of reminding ourselves what God is like and what he calls for from us. The last time we were introduced to Elijah in quite dramatic circumstances. No lengthy introduction to this prophet that the Lord has raised up. We are simply introduced to him with a word he has for Ahab, and then he's on the run being provided for by the Lord. King Ahab and the people are wayward. That's an understatement. They've forsaken the God who delivered his people out of captivity and into this promised land. And under Ahab, they've gotten themselves into the worship of idols, particularly Baal, the so-called rider of the clouds, as we said several weeks ago, the one who brings rain, the one who brings fertility to the land, and therefore, insinuation being the one who gives life. And so God raises up a prophet, Elijah, to deliver a message. The rain will stop. You can turn to your idol. You can turn to Baal and call out for the clouds to come and the rain to be delivered, but I am stopping the rain. And the message is plain and clear. God alone is the one who gives and sustains life. And this message is amplified. If we think back to 1 Kings chapter 17, it's amplified not in the judgment upon a wayward people, but by God's care for his servant Elijah and a widow and her son who he encounters in the epicenter of Baal worship as he heads off to that other place, Zarephath. He goes there, and in that place, Elijah, the widow and her son are cared for in a way that only God can. God who gives and sustains life. And it was amplified in those moments. And this is the Lord's heart for his people. This is what they've turned from. They've turned from a God who loves them and has cared for them, leading them to this promised land. And the Lord wants them to wake them up again, to wake them up to this reality, to the folly of idol worship, to the fact that they sit with divided hearts. And what ultimately he wants for his people and from his people is wholeheartedness, as Rachel has already brought us to that point this morning through the Psalms and in worship. The Lord longs for his people to come to him in a place of wholeheartedness. And that's what we're thinking about this morning as we come to the events of 1 Kings 18, the God who calls us to wholeheartedness. Now the events, and I'm summarizing the start like Rachel did with Psalm 86, I'm summarizing the start of 1 Kings 18. It begins with a promise. Elijah now is to return to speak to Ahab and say, the rains are coming. The rains are coming. And not a moment too soon, because things have become desperate in this land. Drought has turned into famine, so much so that we learn that Ahab has sought the help of Obadiah to find grass and water so that he need not slaughter his livestock. Things have become desperate in this land. And during this quest, Obadiah, part of a faithful remnant that the Lord always preserves for himself, encounters Elijah. Obadiah encounters Elijah, and after some understandable reticence, Obadiah agrees on behalf of Elijah to go tell Ahab that the prophet has returned and he wants to speak to him. Now, Obadiah is reluctant because Ahab's been on the search for Elijah for some time. He sought out surrounding nations to try and find Elijah, thinking that maybe they've been harboring him. And so Obadiah, delivering this word, and given it seems that Elijah has a habit of disappearing, Obadiah is somewhat reticent but agrees in the end to take the message and to bring about this encounter between the wayward king and the prophet of God, Elijah. So we're in 1 Kings 18 and we're starting at verse 16. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." And so Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God." Then all the people said, "What you say is good." Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire." So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. "Baal, answer us," they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered, and they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice came. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. And then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a 3rd time," he ordered, and they did it the 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" Then Elijah commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away." They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered them there. And Elijah said to Ahab, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of heavy rain." So Ahab went off to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed to the top of Carmel, bent down to the ground and put his face between his knees. "Go and look toward the sea," he told his servant. He went and looked. There was nothing there, he said. 7 times Elijah said, "Go back." The 7th time the servant reported, "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." So Elijah said, "Go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds, the wind rose, a heavy rain started falling, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. The power of the Lord came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. This is the Lord's wonderful, astounding word for us this morning. And I want us to walk through this passage, to slow the pace down a little bit now, and to walk through the passage using 5 headings, which I think we have on the next slide, Ben, which will come up. The title for us this morning, "The God Who Calls Us to Wholeheartedness." And those are the 5 headings we're going to walk through this passage with: the cosmic showdown, the indictment of limping faith and a divided heart, the impotence of idols and idolatry, the God who answers by fire and his sovereign glory, and the redemptive horizon as we look from Carmel to Calvary. That's how we're going to walk through this passage this morning. So the first of those headings, the cosmic showdown. You see, what we have here in this moment is a direct confrontation between the God of Israel, the living God, and the pathetic, soul-destroying illusions of idolatry. It's a showdown, and publicly so. God is going to reveal himself once more, not only so that we might see and know him in his glory, but that we might follow him, trust him, surrender our lives fully to him, and cease to live with that divided heart that seems to be such a problem here. And one, I suspect, if we're honest, that we too know sometimes in our own hearts. We look at the text. Ahab meets Elijah, and his first words of Ahab's towards Elijah are an attempt to shift the blame. The present predicament that this land and the people there find themselves in is the cause of Elijah. That's what Ahab says. "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" But Elijah's response mirrors the uncompromising clarity of God's absolute sovereignty. The problem is Ahab. The problem is waywardness. The problem is a people who have forsaken the living God for lumps of stone and wood and metal. And Elijah says, "I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals." And with that, Elijah, now addressing the people, calls for an assembly on Mount Carmel, a prominent ridge projecting towards the Mediterranean Sea, a place historically associated both with the worship of Yahweh, but also a reference point for the regional claims of the Canaanite people who worshipped Baal. This was a showdown. This was a moment of revelation. This was to be a moment of clarity where God would, in his grace, and it's a grace because he could have said, "No, I'm done with this people." But he wanted to show himself again, his glory, his goodness, his grace. And so we have in this moment not a planned private debate, but a public cosmic showdown. So that's the first point for us this morning. Then we come to our second heading, the indictment of limping faith and the divided heart. And when the people of Israel gather on the slopes of Carmel, Elijah confronts them. He confronts them with a question. How long will you go limping between 2 different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. Elijah, of course, knows the answer. But he's putting the challenge front and center before them. They're living as though they can have some bits of Yahweh and they can take on board these other gods and add it to their faith and to their religious framework. And with all these things assembled together, they'll have some sort of super measure to protect them by. But Elijah calls it out for what it is: a divided heart, limping between the Lord and Baal. And the imagery here, the Hebrew word used, gives this kind of graphic imagery of hopping back and forth, not really knowing quite where they stand, but limping one way and then the next. Hobbling unsteadily. And it's exactly the same word that is used to describe those prophets of Baal who begin to hop frantically around the altar, seeking to urge Baal to send something that was never going to come, to burn up the altar and the bull that was on it. Now, we must not misunderstand the nature of Israel's sin here. Their primary error was not a total, explicit rejection of Yahweh, but rather it was an attempt to add Baal worship to who they were and what they did. They weren't completely discarding the God of their fathers. Yahweh was fine for the temple. He was fine for history and for heritage, and he gave them some good stories. But Baal was the god of fertility, the god of rain, the god of the economy. If you wanted more, it was Baal that you turned to. If you wanted crops to grow in the ancient Near East, you paid your dues to Baal. And God's people adopted this as part of their own practice. They started to live like they wanted a portfolio of gods to guarantee their security. To be safe, to be comfortable, to be prosperous in life. They wanted the benefits of the covenant still, but without the exclusive demands of the covenant keeper. And this way of thinking can creep in and can appear subtle and even harmless at times. We can start to adopt this kind of way of thinking whereby we have a divided heart, where ultimately we think that our security comes from how much we have in our bank balance or how strong the walls of our house stand. And I'm not knocking those things as being good and things that we give thanks to God for. But those are secondary to the security and the love that the Lord offers us. But we can start to serve the things of the world. We can seek first those things over seeking first his kingdom. We can start to add and amass these other things that we think bring us some semblance of security without even thinking about it sometimes. Do you know, I was at a church service many years ago now, and I was talking to someone at the time and talking about the treatment that she was going through. And she was talking in the context of course, faith and God being good. And she said, well, and all things being considered, you know, I'm doing well. And touch wood. And then she went to hit the table, but it was a laminated table like our Go-Pack ones. It wasn't genuine wood. It had the appearance of wood. And she literally got up. And by the way, I'm not condemning her because there's subtle ways that we all live out this reality. But she got up until she found a piece of wood she could touch. And of course, that whole idea of touching wood is the avoidance of bad luck. What way of thinking is that? It has no place for those who know the living God. But we can start to live like that, and we can tut our mouths and wag our fingers at these people that have become wayward. But we too can start to live like that, where we seek first not his kingdom or his righteousness, but we go after all the things of this world, and we have divided hearts. And we also can stand quietly when the question is asked of us. Notice the chilling response in verse 21. Elijah's asked this question, who is your God? Worship him. And then the people did not answer him a word. The silence of a guilty conscience, the silence of a people who want to keep their options open. They're paralyzed by their own compromise in these moments. They do not want to choose because a choice implies exclusion, and they want all the options open to them. But there's only one. There's only one. To choose Yahweh in these moments completely means to declare that Baal is an absolute zero, and for a moment it seems like God's people aren't yet ready to let go of that. But God in his grace is going to help them. And it's a wonderful picture of grace, this, that he's going to properly wake them up to the reality of both their foolishness and his glory, because he's not prepared to lose them to the worship of idols. Which brings us to our next heading as we work through this, the utter impotence of idolatry. The impotence of idolatry and the idols that are worshipped. You see, what follows is an intentional, divinely sanctioned mockery of false gods. Elijah gives the prophets of Baal every conceivable advantage. There are 450 of them, and only one of him. He gives them the first choice of the bull. He gives them first chance to go and have all day at it. All day to stir up their God. And they cry out, know how they cry out, "O Baal, answer us," verse 26. But the text records a devastating rhythmic refrain that exposes the absolute vacancy of all their comments and all their utterances. Verse 26, but there was no voice and no one answered. Verse 29, and there was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. And then the frenzy escalates. You know, they become so frenzied by this, they start to slash at themselves with swords and spears so that they would bleed, as was their custom, to try and invoke Baal to intervene in some way or another. And this is tragic. Absolutely tragic in this moment to acknowledge that they think they must do more to invoke a response from this false god, this idol. If our God does not answer, we assume we haven't paid enough, or we haven't done enough, or bled enough, performed enough, sacrificed enough. That's their way of thinking. And then we hear the biting irony of Elijah at noon as he says to them, "Cry aloud, for he is a god." Either he is musing, he's thinking, or he's relieving himself, he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep. He must be awakened. And Elijah is exposing the smallness of their deity, the falseness of it all, the foolishness. Because a God who can be busy, or a God who needs waking up, or a God who can be distracted is no God at all. And every idol that we manufacture for ourselves, everything that we put in the place of God, will ultimately come to zero. There are so many good things that the Lord blesses us with, so many things that the Lord pours into our life, but if we take those things and put it in the place of God, then they will be found wanting. If it's our career, or if it's our retirement account, if it's our reputation, or if it's our physical abilities, whatever it is that we put all our trust in and we put in the place of God, ultimately it will let us down. Won't satisfy. Will remain utterly silent when the world crashes down around us. It has no voice to comfort you. Has no blood to cleanse you. No life to save you. It offers nothing. And that was the indictment upon those prophets of Baal as they danced with frenzied action around the altar. And no one answered. Then comes the fourth of our headings this morning, and we're drawing to a close as we head into these final few headings. The God who answers by fire, revealing his sovereign glory. Then comes the evening, at the time of the evening sacrifice. And Elijah steps forward at this moment. He's been a spectator watching, and of course taking those moments to deride the prophets of Baal for their foolishness. But notice what he does first. He repairs the altar of the Lord that once stood there that had been torn down. He repairs the altar, and he takes 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of Israel. Why? Because he's reminding the people who have gathered to watch, he's reminding them of who they are in the sovereign purposes of God. And they'd forgotten this. He's reminding them of who they are. God is not a local deity to be bargained with here in these moments. He's a covenant-making, promise-keeping, sovereign God who has bought for himself a people. And to make the demonstration that is about to happen undeniably clear, Elijah then saturates the sacrifice. He asks people to bring jars of water, to load it upon the sacrifice, to douse everything with water. And 3 times he orders 4 jars of water to be poured over the wood until everything is drenched and the trench around it is filled up with water. Humanly speaking, combustion is now an absolute impossibility. Humanly speaking. He's gone a stage further. He's made things more difficult than even the circumstances were for the prophets of Baal. And then Elijah prays. Doesn't scream, doesn't cut himself, doesn't dance. He speaks to the sovereign ruler of the universe and says, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are the God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that the people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." This is a radically God-centered prayer. Elijah wants the glory of God to be revealed and for the hearts no longer to be divided among God's people, but to be set firmly upon the Lord. He's praying not for his own vindication, but for the vindication of God's supreme glory. He wants the people to know that Yahweh is God and that God himself is the one who is sovereignly turning their hearts back to him. And then comes the climax. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water. Everything consumed. This is no ordinary spark. This is the down-rushing, consuming glory of Yahweh that is revealed in these moments. Doesn't just ignite the wood, but consumes it and the stones and the very dust it sits upon. It obliterates the watery barrier. It's a visual, historic declaration that Yahweh is a consuming fire. Holy and utterly unmatched in majesty. And when the people see it, they don't discuss it, they don't form a committee. They fall on their faces and they cry out the only logical conclusion left to humanity. The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. What a moment of grace that God should open His wayward people's eyes once more to see and know that they might proclaim in this way. We come to our final heading, and with this we are coming to our close. The redemptive horizon from Carmel to Calvary. You see, if we leave the story here, we might walk away thinking that wholeheartedness is merely a matter of human willpower brought about under the threat of divine judgment. We might think, I just need to stop limping. I just need to pull myself together. I need to build a better altar. I need to perform a better ritual around that altar in order to demonstrate my wholeheartedness to God. But we must read this in the trajectory of God's redemptive plans. The fire that fell on Carmel was a fire of vindication, but it was also a fire of judgment. And the prophets of Baal were executed at the brook of Kishon. Because false prophets under the old covenant, they were, if I can put it like this, they were a cancer eating away at the life of God's people. It needed dealing with. But there's a problem. If the holy fire of God's absolute purity were to fall on our divided hearts today, apart from grace, it wouldn't be just to consume our idols, but us as well. Because we've all limped. We've all struggled. We've all had moments where we live with divided hearts. We've all tried to hedge our bets between the offer that God gives to us and the offerings of the world. How can a holy God call us to wholeheartedness without destroying us in our half-heartedness? And the answer is found only when we move from Carmel to another hill called Calvary. On Mount Carmel, the fire of God fell on a substitute bull, and the guilty people were spared and reclaimed. And on Calvary, the fire of God's holy wrath against sin fell not only on an animal, but on his beloved Son, who stood in our place. Jesus stood on the ultimate mountain of confrontation, the ultimate cosmic showdown. He didn't limp. He didn't have a divided heart like us, but had been the only human being, as one who represented us fully in his human nature, being both God and man. He lived perfectly whole and undivided and uncompromised in his heart and love for the Father. Yet on the cross, he was treated as if he were the ultimate idolater. The sky went dark, worse than the 3 years of drought that Ahab endured, and a cry went out, but there was no voice from heaven to deliver him in those moments. He was consumed so that you and I might be spared. Therefore, when we hear this call of God for us towards wholeheartedness, he's not shouting at you like a drill sergeant demanding some sort of checklist compliance. Stand to attention. He's pointing you to the cross where his glorious love was utterly spent for you and for me. God is the one who calls us to wholeheartedness because he is the only reality great enough to satisfy the whole human heart. In his love and his mercy and his glory and his goodness. Your heart was not designed to be split into fragments. It was made to find its ultimate, unshakable, consuming joy in the display of his glory. And nowhere will we see that on display more so than on the cross of Christ, who died for us and rose again. Stop limping. And this is a message to my own heart. Stop limping. This wasn't a message to the world. This wasn't a message to the prophets of Baal. This was a message to God's people. Stop living with a divided heart. It's a message to the church today. Stop trying to find your security in the things of this world while trying to keep your foot in the kingdom of God. It's an exhausting way to live. See the fire of his holiness. See the depths of his grace upon the cross. And fall on your face, fall down on your knees and say with your life, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God, and he is my supreme joy. This is the God who calls us to wholeheartedness by looking to his Son and our Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, knowing he did on our behalf what we could never do. And by his death and resurrection makes a way for us now to come into his presence, knowing that he will present us before the throne of God without fault, without blemish. That we now, faltering though we often are, can come to him with that desire that has been the petition of our worship so far, to give our lives to him. To offer ourselves to him, to stop living exclusively for the things of this world, but to start living for God, who has reclaimed us and redeemed us to be his own. This is the word of 1 Kings 18, a challenge to not live with divided hearts, but to hear the call of a God who loves us so much he sent his Son to die on the cross for us, to bring us back into a wholehearted devotion to him as our Father, the one who loves us.